Well, it's been forever. Sorry so much about the long wait since the last video that we got to look at some bikes, but this season has just been such a banana show. So much crazy stuff in the bike world these days. The pandemic boom is not over, and the shortage of bikes is very real. Today, this bike just showed up. It's already sold, but as I was putting it together, I was just so impressed by how it looked that I just couldn't help but sharing this with you. This is a 2022 Giant Trance X29 29er. That's part of that X29 name, of course. And I'm going to show you some of the details of this bike and talk about who it's going to be well suited for. If you haven't been here before, this is basically the deal on this channel is you get some dorky redhead looking at a bike here and talking about its features, its specifications, and what's good, what's bad, and maybe how it compares to some other things. And this is it. So onto the bike. Smooth thing. Alrighty, so I'm going old school today. I've been doing a bunch of these videos. I was trying to get all fancy with production, getting some background music, all sorts of other stuff going on. Quite honestly, these days, it's just a lot of work just keeping up with a really busy shop. During spring, during what would usually be a very busy time of the year, and it's been an especially busy time this year. There's still crazy stuff happening in the market. Companies like Giant and Rocky Mountain are noting definite delays in shipments. This is being filmed in the middle of May 2022. Our other brand, Marin, has been pulling miracles out of the hat over and over, and we just keep on getting more and more bikes, and that's what's keeping us super busy, is just so many Marins. Part of the reason that I haven't been filming a pile of bike videos is because a lot of the bikes during the pandemic are proving to be carryovers. So the bike is very similar to a 2021 model, in some cases even very similar to a 2020 model. So I haven't felt that much pressure that I needed to show stuff. This bike here, if for nothing else, and I'm trying to show you from all these different angles, for nothing else, just because of this beautiful finish on the bike, I want to share it with you. And also because I'm honestly jealous that this bike is already sold, because this Trance X29 is a model of bike that I would love to spend some time on. I think between the geometry, especially for me being 6'1", their size large is an absolutely beautiful size, but their geometry, kind of the overall je ne sais quoi. This thing is just going to be an awesome trail bike. I think it suits my kind of style riding, which is I like to do a little bit of everything. I love riding loops. I'm not just about sort of grunting on gravel up to get a good down. I love loops that are long single track climbs, and then anything from high speed to kind of rowdy downs, and maybe a few technical features thrown in. I love all that stuff, and the hint that I love this bike is maybe a hint that that is what this bike really shines at, is being an everything bike. It's not a specialist bike, it's not an enduro bike, it's not a cross-country race bike. It's a bike that is an awesome everything bike, which in my mind is the definition of a modern trail bike. So we're going to talk about some details, features, geometry, and I'll probably make a break right about here. So we'll start with some of the parts on this bike. Some of this equipment on here is really nice. It's got a Shimano SLX 1x12 drivetrain. I love Shimano SLX. I think it is pretty much the diminishing returns around the Dior SLX. Is where you sort of get max performance while still not getting away with the dollar spent. So we've got a 1x12. We've got an SLX cassette on there. So the one nice thing with going SLX cassette is that what you'll see noted in a few tests on these bikes is that the Dior cassettes get a little bit of a bad name just because they're a little bit hefty, and so you hear a common upgrade on a Dior bike, people saying they would do an SLX cassette just to lighten things up. So we've already got that on there. A cool thing that we have on here now is also the SRAM UDH derailleur hanger. So the UDH stands for Universal Derailleur Hanger. The idea there is this is a Shimano drivetrain, but that SRAM UDH is compatible with SRAM or Shimano or Advent, any of the modern drivetrains out there. They're basically trying to get that derailleur hanger to be universal, hence the name, but there's also some special features in there that help it to protect the derailleur just a little bit more than just a standard hanger. So this is finally breaking away from almost every model from every different manufacturer having their own hanger. In this universal derailleur hanger case, you're going to see this on bikes from, like in our store, we've got them on pivots and on Giants right now. And there are a number of other brands out there that are using or planning to use in the near future. So nice to see that. We have really nice chainstay protection on here. You can see that sort of shift in paint here. This particular model is called Chameleon Blue in color. This is one of two colors being offered in this Trance X29 one. The other they call Panther. I would call it black, but this Chameleon Blue is a super cool color. I was kind of joking as I was leaving the shop today that this color is purple because it's green in some light and purple in some other light, and either way it looks really cool. Heading on to the back wheel, it's a 29-inch back wheel, of course, because it's a 29er. We've got a Maxxis dissector, 29 by 2.4. It is set up tubeless. Giant is still one of the few sort of regular priced brands that is actually not just giving you tubeless compatible, but when they ship the bike to us, we already have a tubeless valve in place, a tubeless tire, the tape is in place, they even include the sealant for us. So as this bike was getting built up today, we put the sealant in and it's all ready to go. There are cases when we have a bike that's going to be sitting for a long time that we actually won't put the sealant in right away, because sealant, if it just sits in a tire for a month or two, if somebody lives elsewhere in the country, they bought a bike and they say they're going to pick it up in 2 months, that sealant, if the bike is just parked, is just going to pool in the tire, and you might get kind of a sludgy little puddle there that instead of having sealant spread all around the tire. So dissector rear, super good rear tire choice, because these are known for being a fast rolling tire. They were originally developed with Troy Brosnan with the idea being that this was going to be a hard packed kind of a dry tire, but it's gained popularity, I would say, in a lot of mixed surface riding for being a little bit lighter because the tread is a little bit less bulky, and also for being a fast rolling tire. So it's a popular rear tire in our part of the world, and in other parts of the world it is a popular front and rear for just being a fast rolling, not quite as sluggish as Minions, certainly not as sluggish as something like an Assegai. Part of the magic on any Giant is going to be the Maestro suspension. So when we talk Maestro, Maestro is the patent on having this link combined with that is a link, a front pivot there, another pivot hidden behind the chainring. Those two links, what they will do is result in a floating pivot that will start somewhere virtually around there, and as we go through travel, a Maestro pivot bike, the virtual link will kind of wander down like that. Now what that does for you is basically what makes the Maestro linkage so good is it gives you really good anti-squat and small bump compliance at the beginning of the stroke, because that virtual higher pivot is a little bit like when we're talking about the high pivot bikes with idler pulleys and stuff. That gives you a little bit more rearward axle path, and also quite a bit of anti-squat, which is your drivetrain's natural ability to pedal quite firmly using chain tension for your advantage instead of working against you. And then as you go deeper into the travel, instead of having a bike with an idler pulley and that stuff, your amount of chain growth and your rear wheel path actually shifts to being closer to being concentric around your bottom brackets. So you have more chain growth at the beginning of the pedal stroke, and then it reduces as you go through the pedal stroke. This is kind of the magic that if you look at bikes that have Maestro, or bikes like, especially the way Pivot uses the DW Link, but also Ibis to some extent, that's part of what you get with each of those bikes sharing some somewhat similar design philosophy as far as how you use two short links to get really, really good pedaling dynamics. Another thing that I like about these bikes is that they're quite good at fighting the harsh bottom out. So that is more about this part of the linkage, and the fact that that is going to basically control your shock ratio. So as you go through the travel, at the end of the pedal stroke, you have a rising rate basically, so it's harder to bottom the shock out than it is to initiate the stroke. And then it's optimized so that you're getting really good pedaling in that 25 to 30% sag rate, which is why they sort of specify that when you're setting up the bike. So carrying on with the spec, we talked about the fact that we've already got a tubeless setup. Our rims are a 30mm internal rim on here. So that is going to help you to get really nice performance out of that 2.4 wide trail tire. So that WT on the description there, that means that that tire is designed to be run on a 30mm wide rim essentially. So the tire profile works out really well with that. Heading down to the cranks, we have the Praxis Cadet cranks. Not much to say about them. I'd probably prefer to see a Shimano crankset, but these have proved to be pretty good. My only knock would be these Praxis chain rings. They use this wave technology, and it's part of their way of getting around the patent that there is a patent on the true narrow wide chain rings, and so Praxis gets around the narrow wide thing by actually having sort of a left-right sprocket or a tooth profile on there as opposed to narrow wide. They still tend to hold the chain quite well, though it may not be quite as good as a narrow wide. And one thing to know is if you ever do lose your chain off there, pay attention to, as this little diagram is showing, there is sort of a specific way that you want to run your chain on there. Just like on a narrow wide, it won't go on in a certain way when you've got the fat teeth at the inner, on the inner plates of the chain, if that's making any sense. Moving on to some really nice bottom of the down tube protection. Now this is pretty common stuff. Both of these protection things on here, this, like the real, you can maybe just see a little bit of texture on there. It does seem like a tad more sophisticated, the way they've done this protection than what we see on some other bikes. The cable routing is also really, really clean. I'm not a fan of those rubber grommet things. They, especially when we're talking about the ones up here by the head tube, they can be a hassle from turning the bars and kind of popping them out. But they're also simple and you don't have little threads that you might strip out. But the overall cable routing, internal, it comes outside here, cleanly routed, actually zip tied onto the top of that bottom Maestro link, and then disappearing inside and then coming back out of the bottom of the chainstay. So it's nice cable routing. It seems like most companies are finally getting cable routing to the point where it's either good or great. We don't have the hellacious old school big droops of cable sticking out the bottom and causing go shifting and all the other garbage of days past, which Giant I don't think ever suffered from, but we certainly saw some Specialized and other brands over the years that had some issues. I'm just zooming in on the flip chip on this bike, and I'll discuss that, I guess, right about now, because that makes sense. The flip chip on there, what that is going to do is give you a little bit of adjustment to your bottom bracket height off the ground, and also your head angle and your seat tube angle. A slack head tube angle means your wheel is going to be, this angle is going to be more like that if it's slack, more like that if it's steep. And the kind of adjustments that flip chip will do is 0.7 degrees, which I was just having a discussion with a customer today who has actually a Rocky Mountain that has similar amount of adjustment on its Ride 9. And he, after a few years of having that bike, we'd sort of prompted him to play with that, and he was shocked at how much difference it makes, and that he will actually play with his settings depending on if he's doing like a heavy descending day or a day that's going to be really grunting through some longer, more cross-country-ish trails. So both head angle and seat angle are adjusted with that. In the slack setting, this bike is at 65.5 degrees in the head tube and 77.2 degrees in the seat tube. So if we go into the steep mode, that means that we actually end up at 66.2 degrees there and 77.9 degrees there. The idea there, what's happened with geometries is that the steeper the seat tube angle, the more directly above your cranks your seat's going to be. So if you can imagine this bike is climbing up a hill, the steeper that seat tube is, the more you're still going to be sitting over top of your cranks rather than sitting way behind your cranks and your bike wanting to wheelie on you. So seat tube angle is largely about giving you a really good climbing position without you having to pull your face really far forward to stop from wheeling. Head tube angle is largely about descending in a high speed traction, cornering, stability sort of thing. So the slacker that head tube angle, the more stability you get. The slacker that head tube angle, the more I think you need to concentrate on having really good riding technique to keep your weight on your front wheel in corners, especially flat corners, to stop from your front wheel washing out. That has become a big theme the last few years. All the companies are going slacker, and a lot of, especially long time riders, sadly, who are used to old school steep head tube angled bikes are basically struggling with having to adapt their technique now that you're really leaning the bike a lot more when steering, as opposed to just turning your handlebars to go around a corner. So if that's you, if you've been riding for a long time, if you struggle with front wheel washouts, go take a few courses in how to ride a mountain bike, because this is turning into much more than just riding your bike off-road. This is to get the most of it. It really is technique, and it sort of, that right technique answers the question, how does that person ahead of me go around that corner so fast while I don't feel safe doing that at all? We of course have a dropper seat post on here. It's a Giant branded dropper post. I believe this is a 170mm dropper on this size large. Attached to that dropper seat post, I should say those Giant droppers have proved to be quite good. They're essentially treated like a bargain post. For the first couple of years of use, I find them to be quite good. You do get the occasional person that gets mystery issues, but I think that's sort of the case with a lot of posts. We've seen that happen on expensive posts. But for 2 years, for people that ride quite a bit, you get really, really good solid performance. Yeah, so nothing to complain about there. Attached to the seat post is one of my favorite saddles on the market, the Giant Romero saddle. This is new as of last year from Giant, really. The old Giant saddles used to be some of the most heinous, butt-hurting saddles you could ask for. I have actually taken one of these that was taken off by somebody who wanted to put a big squishy saddle on their bike. And I have that on my Rocky Mountain Element at the moment, so that's how much I like it. I put one on my own bike. We'll just show you a little bit more of the details of how this paint is doing its amazing color thing, how we go from black back here to then that sparkly goodness, the Trance X logo on the top, some cable routing. On this particular bike, being actually both Trance X29ers, there's a Trance X29-2 and a Trance X29-1. They both come with this Fox DPS rear shock. So, did I even mention the price yet? This thing is $43.99. There is a Trance X29-2 that is $38.99. Same rear shock, but with SRAM SX drivetrain on it. And also with a RockShox 35 as compared to this bike here having a Fox 36. Talking about the suspension there, this is a 135 millimeters rear travel, 150 millimeter travel fork. So that puts this, I would say, right in the thick of things these days. We've seen trail bike travels become acceptable starting at about 120 mils in the back, going up to 150, usually above that, and we start to think about the bike as being a bit more of an enduro bike. But 135 is right in the middle of that zone. And like I said, this thing is an awesome trail bike. It's a up, down, go everywhere kind of a bike. Stem on this bike is a little bit longer than we're seeing from some comparisons. And while some people might take that as a thing to criticize because the trendy cool guy thing to do these days is to have a 35 or a 50 mil stem, I think this is 60 mils on a size large. I think it actually helps the bike to work well for, as I described it, being a bit of, or a really good at everything kind of a bike. This particular bike is coming with these Tektro Orion or Orion, or I don't know what else you can call them. Anyways, they're 4-piston brakes. They're Tektros. This bike originally was spec'd with the Shimano 5 series brakes, which is sort of like the no-name Dior level of brakes. Unfortunately, we have issues with availability, so this is what I think about half the bikes out there are coming with. I would rather have the Dior brakes, quite honestly, but these, for being Tektros, they aren't too bad. I remember one of the shop guys got them on a bike that he bought a few years ago, and when he first got the bike, he said that was going to be one of the first things he would change. And a year later, he hadn't yet, because while they weren't the most powerful brakes, they were pretty consistent, and he basically learned to live with them and concentrated on replacing other stuff that he needed to replace because he was destroying it. That was on a different bike. We've got an SLX shifter here. It is on its own clamp, not on an I-spec type clamp, so some people might like the fact that you have a little bit more freedom. These grips, which are a really nice, or in my mind, they're a little bit slimmer, not quite so squishy, and with an alloy lock-on ring there. So a nice quality grip on here. Just going back to this rear shock. So it's a DPS, that blue lever that in the middle zone right now, that's in the trail setting. These, basically you have 3 different settings on one of these shocks. Wide open, which is what I ride my Giant Trances in always, or any Giant I've ridden, I just ride wide open. Some people choose this middle position, which is the trail position, and just leave it there all the time. The one thing I tell most people is the old idea of locking out your bike on climbs and then going to open on descents. Almost everybody that does that spends half their time being frustrated because they forget to flip it and end up with a heinous down. One of the nice things with this Maestro suspension is that you will, or most people end up just deciding if they like how it feels in this trail position or in that wide open position when it's over like that. And then you just spend all your time riding there and you don't have to think about it. That is the big plus of just getting a really good, efficient pedaling suspension platform, that you don't have to use those band-aids for poor suspension designs. On the fork, as I mentioned, it's a Fox 36. It's a performance, not a performance elite series. And so in the performance, you either get a grip damper, or in this case, they actually call this a fit grip damper, which I will even admit to being kind of ignorant on. As far as I can tell, it is just a little bit more fancy than a standard grip damper, because you actually get these more pronounced settings between really firm and really open. And so you treat this a little bit like you treat that on your rear shock, where for me, once I've got my air pressure set up and I've got my rebound set up, which is done under there, I personally have never touched a lockout on a fork in my life. Maybe if you're doing a stage race and you have to ride up some long gravel forever, you would consider locking that and that out, but otherwise I honestly don't even understand the purpose of lockouts on forks or shocks in this modern day where things work. That gives you an idea of what that Giant dropper looks like, or dropper remote. It's a nice alloy lever on there. I'm kind of surprised. Some people just get really carried away with how much they like certain other alloy dropper remotes. You push it and it does its job, so I don't understand getting super excited about certain brands or models of droppers. That's about the only place there that you actually see a noticeable Giant logo on this bike. So unlike a lot of bikes, you pretty much have a pretty stealthy, brandless looking bike. Going on to the front wheel here, we have a Minion DHR 29 by 2.5, once again in that WT or wide trail to make it work really nicely on that 30mm wide rim. Also set up tubeless. One thing to note, front and rear tire are both with EXO casing. So this is lighter casing, not ultra light, but that is the one thing. If this bike was getting used harshly, somebody might choose on that rear tire to go to an EXO Plus or a double down if they were really smashing around or riding in an area that has a lot of real chundry stuff, to get a heavier casing for some protection and to allow you to ride that rear tire a bit softer for extra traction. I'll show you what those Tektro brakes look like. As I said, they're 4-piston. They feel a little bit like when you actually sort of feel and hear them on the rotors. It's got a little bit of a sensation of sandpaper, which is the one thing that I would say, like, there's a tactile thing about the Tektro brakes. It's just a little bit harsh. You do get used to it. But that would be my biggest knock, is just that certain something that you sort of pick up with your ears and with your senses between something that feels great and not so great. That's my knock on that guy. I'm just having a peek. I believe that is a 180mm rotor on the back, a 203 rotor on the front. I'm looking for verification. This is how prepared I am right now. I just want to get a video out. It's been so long. Yeah, it says 203. My eyeballs didn't deceive me on that. Another thing to see, because we're onto that brand new Fox style fork, we've got the little bleeder valve. So on both legs you kind of have that little thingy there. That is basically so that if you build up air pressure below your seals, you can basically dump out that pressure by just pressing a little button that's in there. The other sign of the fact that these are new is the arch shape has changed on new Fox. Other stuff about your cockpit. 780 millimeter wide giant alloy handlebar. They seem to have a nice bend. They're a little bit less randomly noodle shaped than some stock handlebars I've seen that don't have a name brand on them from other brands. And that is a bunch of the details. Are you sick of listening to me talk about this yet? I'm just going to go into some stuff about this bike to make sure I don't miss anything. As I mentioned, this is a size large. On a large, the reach is 486 millimeters. That in the slack setting, that I think is, I'm 6'1". That is like in my dream zone for a really nice reach. All of the geometry numbers on this bike are just right where I like them. The one thing that I do struggle with on this bike is that the 486 reach on a large, the next size down, a size medium, has a 456 millimeter reach. So a 30 millimeter change from one size to the other. It sort of feels to me like the way this bike is sized, that people in that 5'10" to right around 5'10", are probably going to feel a little bit like they're between sizes, which I think is kind of sad, because 5'10" seems to me like about the most average height for a guy. The one upside I would say is that for that particular person, they could use this for the size large with its 486 reach. They could put a 35 mil stem on here, and I think that they will end up getting both a seated and a standing reach that will work quite well for them. It makes the bike a little bit more kind of descending centric if you shorten that stem a lot, or a little bit more aggressive riding centric because you really need to weight your hands a bit more when you've got a shorter stem. But I think that's the easy out, and that if I was working for Giant and if it was an oopsie that those measurements had that big leap, I would probably fall back to that being the, oh yeah, but you can shorten the stem. Weight on this bike, I honestly forgot to weigh this before leaving the shop, but I'm pretty sure I have weighed one of these, and they're right around the 30-pound mark, like within half a pound, and I think they sit just under the 30 pounds, so it might be like 29.9 pounds. So let's call it 30 pounds because between different bikes, even different tire weights from production, you're going to have a 0.2 pound fluctuation probably. So officially it's 29.9 pounds because that's what I just made up. As I mentioned, there's two versions of this bike in the alloy, the Trance X29 1 and 2. The Trance X29 2, $38.99. This one is $43.99. I would personally take this one every day of the week for the extra money because that fork is worth it and that SLX drivetrain is just oh so awesome. There are also carbon versions of this bike, but Giant really got transfixed and kind of stuck on doing a fair amount in the carbon versions of this bike with the Fox Live valve, which tends to make the price jump up a fair bit. From a good friend at Giant, he is becoming a huge fan of the Live valve, so I have been probably guilty of moaning about Live valve because I think it's a bit of an expensive question to a not so expensive or expensive answer to a not so expensive question. But when he says that he really likes something, I sort of take that to be meaningful. So the newest version of Fox Live Valve might be something to get excited about for all those people out there. As I mentioned, if we're talking about who this bike suits, who any of these Trance X29 ones suit, it's the person who does a bit of everything. You might want a bike that you can take on a road trip and have something suitable for everything that doesn't require a free ride bike or a cross-country race bike. This is pretty much the halfway point between them. Also, speaking of the Trances, don't get confused. There is now a Trance X29, this one with the 135, 150 travel combination. There is a Trance X that doesn't have the 29 in the name. That one has 27.5 wheels and a touch more travel. And then there's also now a new Trance 29, which looks like another dream bike with a little bit less travel than this, but actually very similar geometry numbers. So it's just the bike that takes this and sort of makes it a tad more zippy, a tad less rumble in the Bronx kind of attitude, but equally awesome. This has been my first video in a long time. I hope I haven't rambled, but I've been trying to do this kind of in a freestyle manner. I got this as my cheat sheet, then I'm just looking at the specs as we're talking about this bike. I have a little bit of enthusiasm because I love this bike, and I think it's awesome, and so I wanted to share stuff about it. I also missed all of the peeps out there. You hear people talking about this YouTube community thing all the time, and it sounds like such a load. But there's actually a lot of really good comments, and even some of the questions have had me looking stuff up because I got to make sure I keep on top of some of the technical stuff I'm talking about. And some of the questions actually do drive me to research things and make sure I'm not blowing smoke out of my butt. And so far I've been pretty on the ball with the stuff I've been saying. But thanks so much to everybody for watching. I'm going to do the swing around here without looking. I'll try and look at myself. So there we are. That's the bike that we were just talking about. This is me. I'm wearing a new shirt. How do you like that? And we will hopefully get some really exciting bikes in. And if you don't mind this kind of freestyle format of just listening to some old dude who spent the last 35 years of his life working on bikes, talking about bikes, if you like that format, let me know. If you don't like it, let me know, but don't be too cruel about it because this is already a lot of work. All right, thanks so much, and we'll talk to you again soon.